The first cicadas rose before the sun, a rasp of tiny saws sharpening the edge of morning along the Yazoo River. Dew jeweled the cotton leaves and blackened the hem of her skirts where she brushed through, moving with the practiced economy of someone who knew how to look busy while her mind ran elsewhere. She carried a pail of larded biscuits toward the big house kitchen, but her thoughts were already under the stair in the dim cupboard where she kept the thing she wasn't supposed to have, pages stitched into a quilt lining, ink folded into the seam. The girls at the pump spoke of marriages and brandings and what Sheriff Carlson did when whiskey took him, yet Aunt Lark counted steps and letters in the quiet, steady beat of a plan. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. They called her Needle Girl at Whitford Barrow's place because she mended uniforms smooth as new bark and hemmed the mistress's muslin with stitches so fine they vanished. But the name hid other talents. Ansa knew the river's voices, how it changed tone before a fog, how willow roots clutched the bank like the fingers of a sleeping giant, how drift announced itself by knocking twice against the cistern stones. She knew the kitchen's secret hours too, when Mrs. Barrow's breathing thickened with afternoon laudanum and the scullery drained of gossip long enough for a woman to lace different ingredients together, not pepper and salt, but scraps of knowledge and scraps of cloth. The cupboard under the stair smelled like onions and iron. Ansa knelt and slid her hand into the shadow between a slumping broom and a flour sack with a mouse-bit corner. From a tin where lard once lived she lifted the quilt square she had pieced from unremarkable brown calico. Its backside held the crime. Pressed between cloth and batting were 2 pages torn from a farmer's almanac, moon phases, the length of days, notes on weather and tides scribbled in a hand that wasn't hers. She had salvaged those pages from a trash fire the year she turned 13. The overseer, Pike, had sneered at the smoke and used the toe of his boot to push a little flame, making the numbers curl. Ansa had waited until dark, then plucked the scorched paper and hid it for what came later. She learned her letters at the wash line, as soap slick as minnows, repeating them under her breath while shirts flapped coat into the wind. The first word she wrote was river. The second was stay. The third was don't. The fourth was run, and that one lived a long time behind her teeth before it found its legs. On a Tuesday, when the sky wore a thin cloud the color of fresh milk, Mrs. Barrow sent for her to repair a fraying lace collar. The missus's lip bore a tiny sore from biting it in vexation. Her nerves were either bad or a weapon, depending on the day. "You will sit by the window," the missus said. "Mind the light." Ansa sat, and the window shot a bar of summer across her lap. Out between the columns a man led 2 black boys with rope harnesses towards the barn. The shorter boy limped, his heel had been split last month for taking molasses without a tally mark to pay for it. Mrs. Barrow wagged 2 brittle fingers. "Your thread is dull, girl. Go fetch a better coil from the workbox." The workbox lived in the corner, heavy with skeins and tassels of silk. Tucked beneath a tray of bone buttons, Ansa had a small cache that was not silk at all. She had collected it the way crows collect foil. The first piece was from the judge's discarded linen shirt, torn under an arm. Mrs. Barrow had complained that her husband smelled of courtrooms and cigar leaf. The second piece was a twist of their daughter's yellow ribbon, caught and left behind in the cane near the carriage house. The third piece was a single silver hair she had coaxed from Judge Barrow's comb after Pike tossed it on the laundry table as if combs didn't tell private stories. Ansa lifted the coil of fine cotton thread and beneath it touched those secrets with the pad of one finger. The judge's linen had dried sweat along the edge where she had torn it. Salt changed cloth. Salt remembered. She slipped the thread into her palm, returned to the window, and let her hands do what they were praised for while her mind gathered its own ingredients. Each night for a week she met Mother Ludi near the cypress fringe where the river hoarded shade. Ludi's hair was as white as cane sugar gone pale in a jar, and when she smiled one canine hung longer, like a little fawn that had forgotten it belonged to a human mouth. She was not anybody's mother officially, the name had come from how she could cradle grief without tipping it. Folks said she'd been born on an island where drums spoke the weather. Folks said she'd been born under a wagon on the Natchez Trace when the world was all mud. Ludi never confirmed any of it. She had a voice like cool water poured into a hot skillet, and when Ansa confessed the outline of her plan, Ludi nodded as if seeing a stitch her own fingers had considered once. "You want to break a man," Ludi said, "but you also want him to break himself for you." "I want him to be afraid of the wrong thing until the right thing walks past him," Ansa said. It shocked her, the truth of it once it rose into air. If his eyes are turned inside his skull, he won't be watching the river. Ludi chuckled. "We will make him a mirror that lies." They brought a small basket between them that night, Spanish moss, cypress needles, powdered clay Ansa had brushed from the bank where the dirt ran red iron into the water, and the linen strip from the judge's shirt. Ludi added a scale from a fish too small to eat but perfect for symbol, a bead of rabbit blood taken with a thorn and dripped onto a piece of paper where a circle had been drawn around the judge's name without writing it whole. "Not for the devil," Ludi whispered, "for the mind." Ansa's palms remembered $100 from her girlhood, pinched out from corn husks for the younger ones to play with arms like knuckle brooms. This doll would be different. She stitched it from the judge's linen and her own brown calico, the inside soft with moss and clay, the outside pale as a man too long indoors. She did not give it a face. She gave it weight. She stitched the yellow ribbon piece like a vein that ran from throat to chest. She tucked the silver hair deep inside at what would be the heart, then set the doll beneath a bowl by the kitchen hearth to take in heat slowly, as if to bake the memory of the man into the cloth. When the bowl cooled, she poked 3 pins into the braid upon its back, not into the cloth itself, but into the plait of thread she had made for it, tight and deliberate. "Not yet," she told Ludi when the older woman lifted an eyebrow. "He will hurt when I say the day." "The day for pain," Ludi said, and grinned. "The day for fog." Ansa kept the doll under the stair in her lard tin, wrapped in a scrap of sackcloth that smelled faintly of coffee. She carried the key to the stair cupboard threaded into the lining of her bodice where it rested warm against her skin. She learned to feel the weight of it by habit. She learned the weight of other things too, the judge's temper by the pitch of his boot heels, the overseer's boredom by the length of his shadow at noon, the river's appetite by the way it chewed the footings of the little landing after a rain. In those same days she studied the plantation's ledger while pretending to dust it. The judge was proud of his figures. He liked to see the rows clean and exact, as if precision could bless what was entered there: ages, prices, weights, births written as inventory, deaths written as loss. Ansa practiced her hand in the margins where the judge never looked, shaping letters small enough to hide in the linen's woven cross, practicing numbers until she could copy a tally well enough that Pike's casual glance would slide off it. Then she began to place marks in those margins that meant nothing to a man looking for arithmetic but much to the persons watching for a kind of weather she was trying to make. 1 diagonal meant watch the river. 2 meant fog coming if wind holds. A small circle meant keep the children near after dark. A circle with a cross through meant a packet will come. Those packets were secrets wrapped in meat. The kitchen was the one place on Barrow's land where a message could pass from hand to hand without a shout. Ansa tucked rolled scraps of written words inside the marrow hole of a soup bone and sent it out with gravy to the quarters. Ludi distributed it by portioning seconds for those who smacked their lips just so. In the evenings Ansa took bread to the smokehouse where Josh the blacksmith leaned in the door and breathed ash. His body was like a grammar of iron, made of bending and fixing, his eyes yellow at the corner in a way that suggested a cat had agreed to watch him. Josh had a half-built skiff behind the smokehouse, planks planed thin and a lantern set benevolent on the grass. He had worked boat bottoms when the judge lent him out upriver for a season and watched men disappear into fog that shipwrights called God's wool. "This river is a choir," he told Ansa once, "and fog is the hymn that makes men's voices break." They spoke little with their mouths. They spoke with the placing of hands on wood, with whether Josh set a nail into his teeth while he thought. Ansa brought him a length of twine she had braided from threads left over from the mistress's ripped skirts and he understood, they would need more than 1 rope and it must not gleam in torchlight. He had already thought of stowing an oar in Mrs. Barrow's doll's trunk. Mrs. Barrow collected porcelain girls with faces like fever. The trunk was heavy and no one moved it but Ansa. The oar lay there like a sleeping fish. There were things Ansa would not allow herself to picture. She did not picture bodies in the river, not even white bodies, though she had a right to be angry. She did not picture the judge bleeding or the missus screaming until her throat shredded. She did not picture burning the big house, though it would have taken only one lantern tipped in the right place. She had seen burning done, and it did not end a story so much as change its mask. What mattered was birthing a day where somebody could call their own name without fear, and won't that be its own fire, she thought. The judge came home from court with a new cruelty polishing his hand. A law had been argued that made him feel tall. Ansa could tell by the set of his collar and the way he gestured with his cigar as if it were a scepter that rode in smoke. He snapped at Pike to count the line. By morning, a buyer was coming from Vicksburg who wanted 3 girls of first bleeding age, 1 boy with strong wrists, and a wet nurse no older than 25. "Don't bring me complaints," the judge said. "Bring me bodies that breathe." Ansa stood at the door, quiet as a piece of furniture. Inside her, an extra muscle clenched. Ludi had told her, "A plan has rooms. You look in each one every night and see which of the furniture has moved. You will know when a chair rocks by itself." This buyer would rearrange more than furniture. This buyer's list was a finger pushed into the soft of the world. That night, Ansa went to the cypress fringe to find Ludi already there with her hands between her knees, fingers trembling like little flags. "It has to be sooner," Ansa said. "He means to sell Alma. She is still bleeding from her first. The wet nurse is Vera with the milk for her own baby, and he's the one who limps because Pike split his heel. He'll be taken too for strong wrists." Ludi nodded and closed her eyes. "It will be sooner. The fog will come after the next rain. We will make him look inward now." They took the doll from the lard tin. They walked it out to the cypress knee where somebody had carved a little cross a long time ago with a nail, back when the river ran 2 inches higher and men fell into it because nothing else had given them a choice. Ludi pricked her finger with a thorn from the rose hedge that had climbed the judge's fence and let a single drop wet the linen chest. "For this one," she whispered, "let fear be the bed." Ansa slid the first pin into the braid at the base of the doll's skull, and to her surprise she felt a little echo in her own neck as if the world were a drum tuned too close. She placed the second pin low, between what would be ribs if the doll were a man. She held the third pin, then set it aside. "Not yet," she murmured. "Tomorrow he will sit wrong. Our first fog will be inside his bones." Morning fed the plantation its chores. Pike swaggered along the row like a rooster pretending to have invented the sun. The judge stood on the veranda with his teacup and his silver spoon and muttered about the quality of horses. When he sat, he jerked, hand at his back. "Damn this chair," he snapped. He switched chairs and again reached for the place lower ribs met spine. Mrs. Barrow, half sweet from laudanum, crooned, "Your gout now wants to be in the middle of you." He sent for the physician, Mr. Quill, who smelled like wintergreen and vinegar. Mr. Quill listened to lungs and pinched nails and pronounced nothing. "An agitation, Judge." Perhaps some pork did not agree. That night, Ansa pressed the second pin deeper. The doll took it quietly. Ludi hummed a tune an island might have made before it sank. Over the next days, Ansa braided more than thread. She braided attention. She watched which men looked toward the judge when the judge raised his voice. She watched which men looked away, ashamed for themselves, because shame is a resource too if you know how to turn it. She watched which women drew their children under their skirts when Pike prowled by. She watched who left a crust near the steps in a way that meant "I am hungry and quiet," the kind of hunger that could be taught to wait for an hour so someone else could eat first. The buyer from Vicksburg sent a note by a white boy with a scar that split his eyebrow. It said he'd arrive on Saturday with coin and a receipt book bound in calfskin. The judge stood at the veranda and smiled at his green lawn the way a man smiles at a creature he is trained to fetch. That smile lit something ugly behind Ansa's eyes. That night she pushed the third pin smooth down until it lay cool against the doll's belly. The judge woke before dawn to the certainty of needles in his middle. He cursed the mattress, then the cook, then the medicinal whiskeys of last evening, then his God who had lately become an accountant in his prayers, counting sins like corn. He went to his study while the house still breathed sleep and found his ledger on the desk with a ribbon keeping yesterday's place. There were 3 tiny diagonal marks just inside the paper's blind edge at his favorite page, shallow as a whisper. He startled at them as if the page had spoken his name while his back turned. He ran a finger along their slant. His breath went smaller. Ansa had waited for that. She had dusted the ledger herself at dusk and placed those diagonals where as I left off, and his mind continued, the place where things slip through. She had used the yellow ribbon to press the page because she knew he would take pleasure touching the silk as if it carried his daughter's perfume, and pleasure leaves a person unguarded as sleep. Mrs. Barrow, used to managing another body's nerves like a cackling hen, sent for a preacher the following day to settle the judge's spirit. "Your father is plagued in his innards and in his sky," she told her daughter. "Fetch Reverend Greaves. He knows how to open a window in a man's skull and let air in." The Reverend came with a Bible that thumped and a wife who watched everything as if the world were a scandal she had not been invited to. He sat with the judge, and from the kitchen door, Ansa watched with lowered lashes as the men prayed. The judge trembled on the word deliver. Ansa felt it like a current through her skin. It meant he had stepped onto a floor she had laid for him, and it creaked. That night she used a new thing. She took ash from the kitchen hearth and mixed it with flour until it made a gray powder that would not taste like ash or flour but like nothing at all. She shook it from her fingers along the threshold of the judge's study in a line no wider than a thread. In the morning there were 3 smears in that line the size of a ring finger's tip. Anyone can make a mark and call it an omen. The art is to make it at a time and place where it will be believed. Mrs. Barrow believed. She whispered to the Reverend's wife in the hallway, and the whisper ran up the staircase like water under a door. Word flowed too to the quarters. People who understood more than they spoke passed it between hands while lifting kettles and splitting wood. "The judge has got a haunt. The judge got a prickle in his side where a baby first kicks. The judge is counting at night, and his numbers bite him back." Josh listened, then spit calmly into the dirt. He greased the skiff's plank seam with a bit of bare fat as if blessing it. "Noise can be a cover, same as fog," he murmured when Ansa passed with a basket. "Keep the noise pointed at him." Pike smelled the air like a dog and didn't like that he didn't know which way the smell came from. He took to pacing late. He took to leaning by the nursery door where Mrs. Barrow's porcelain girls peered from their trunk like little witnesses. He took to tapping his whip against his boot top as if his hand needed reminding that it had something to hold. On Friday evening a storm stacked far off, one slate sheet upon another until the horizon wore a wall. Ludi put her palm to the wet and said to Ansa, "It will break around midnight and lay down a fog as thick as milk when morning comes. That is your hymn. It won't sing twice." Ansa's heart made a small hard jump. Inside its echo she saw the shape of Saturday like a room she had stood outside a long time before being invited in. She touched the doll, which had warmed in her hands, or maybe her hand had warmed it. She took out the pins from its braid and placed them one by one into a tin by the window where the stormlight turned them into 3 short lines of rain. "Tomorrow," she told them. "In daylight, when he thinks priests hold heaven like a leash." The buyer from Vicksburg arrived in a carriage the color of old yoke, his hat brim mean with the edges sun-bit. He stepped from the carriage the way some men step into a church, already thinking of who will see them kneel and what that kneeling will purchase. He shook the judge's hand. Their palms met like 2 toads fattening on flies. Ansa stood in the kitchen doorway and watched men's mouths where prices where their smiles should be. She could smelling from the receipt book before she could read the lines in it. The buyer walked the yard like a man in a market, weighing fruit with his thumbnails. He pointed at girls and said, "Spin," as if they were fabrics. Alma spun. Her braids flared and the look inside her had the exact reach of a deer who has decided the dog is slower but the bullet is not. Vera held her baby under her breast and blinked toward some far place where Justice and Dream had kissed but not yet produced a child. Pike, exultant in being deputized, strutted with a little book of his own. His boots made a wet sound in mud the storm had mixed. Ansa had to swallow twice before the biscuit in her throat went down. Mrs. Barrow wanted tea under the veranda awning where the storm cooled the air enough to make her think of sympathy. Ansa poured. She poured too slow on purpose at one moment, which made Mrs. glance at her wrist as if to consider a slap. But the Reverend's wife arrived at that same instant with the smell of a pious importance, thrusting into Mrs. Barrow's hand a folded note from a friend in Jackson about a dress material. Mrs. Barrow read, forgot the slap already, and said, "Bring my lavender shawl." Ansa brought it, and in that little gap while the ladies fussed fabric, she slipped down the hall like a fish and reached the study. The ledger lay open with its ribbon. She had prepared this page a week ago, lines crisp as fence rails, 2 diagonals, then a circle with a cross. She drew one more mark, so small it could have been a fleck of dirt, at the bottom outside the lines, not a symbol they'd used yet, not something anyone would read as anything. But Josh would see the smudge at the page's bottom when the judge, fretful, turned to check his maths. Josh would read it as Doc, or. He'd planned for the skiff to wait behind the smokehouse at dusk. Now it would be behind the cane brake in an hour. The judge entered the study while she still stood by the desk with a duster. He frowned. "Who told you to touch that?" "The missus asked me to dust," Ansa said, placing the duster gently on the corner as if it were a bird she'd coax from sill to finger. She did not look at the ledger. She looked at the judge's hand where blue veins pooled under skin thin as onions. He rubbed his side again, and his face twitched like a man listening for boots behind him on a stair in a house he didn't own. "Move," he said, and she did. He bent to the ledger and his eyes caught on the diagonal as if trying to make a line continue when it refused. He shut the book and opened it again, as if the trick would teach itself. From the doorway, Mrs. Barrow called, "Do not keep our guest waiting, Whitford. He is drinking tea like a lady and will think I mean to marry him." "I'll have a word with Pike first," the judge muttered. "He's grown sloppy. I want those girls examined for faults. My money will not. He had to pause and grip the desk because the second pin she had already pushed long ago decided this was the moment to announce itself. Ansa went back to the kitchen where she could feel the house in her shoulders. Houses tell on themselves when they panic, their boards creak the way men do when they lie. She ladled gravy over meat and slid a bone aside to cool. The bone had a hole where marrow had been scooped. She rolled a tiny scrap of paper and pressed it in with her smallest finger. It said only "bring the ore." Josh fetched the tray to carry to the nailers at the fence and his fingers brushed hers like a word unpronounced. She could almost hear it. He walked away without hurry as a shape a whip knows how to recognize. The blacksmith ate standing by the fence, then put the tray down in the grass and set the bone in his pocket the way a man sets his heart back in after it has jumped. Toward 4 the rain shredded into thin curtains and the sun peered through with an embarrassed look, late for an appointment after a sulk. The river rose at its edges and tested the dock with little licks of brown water. Fog did not yet bloom, but its seed had been planted. Ansa moved through the kitchen like wind learning its way around her room, touching this, moving that, making small inconveniences that would yield a window later. A barrel casually rolled near the back door into a position that would wedge it open with a nudge, a jar placed just so where it would rattle when the cat brushed it, drawing Pike at exactly the wrong moment, a pail upturned for a child to step into quickly if small legs needed help reaching the window's low sill. The buyer finished his selecting. His book looked fat with signatures that were not signatures of the ones being sold. The judge wiped his neck with a square of cloth the color of pale corn silk and told Mrs. Barrow to fetch him a cleaner shirt. He had sweated through his fine linen like a man who had worked for his money. Ansa knew that cloth intimately. It would scratch his chest now because she had taken a strip for the doll and the seamstress had mended it, but it never lay right again after she did. Tiny misalignments work like sand in oysters. Dusk gathered. Flies went slow. The river's voice deepened as if the water's throat had opened and wanted to sing. Fog walked in from the far bank on soft feet, turning trees into ghosts of themselves. Ansa took the doll out. She held it in the dark between her ribs and her forearms. She spoke to it without sound, a language that had been hers since she was small and learned that some words are better with the mouth shut. She waved a willow switch once above it to count 1. Then she placed the first of the 3 pins back into the braid at its nape. The judge lurched in the dining room and dropped his spoon. "Hell's teeth," he muttered. "It feels like a dog worrying a bone at my spine." Mrs. Barrow frowned, but the Reverend's wife leaned forward with a happiness that had a little rot in it. Do you see now, sir, that there is warfare we cannot taste? Let the Reverend pray again. He did. The judge swallowed the prayer like a stone and let it sit heavy. Ansa set the second pin between the doll's ribs. She counted under her breath, 2. In the yard, Pike lifted his head from telling a boy to scrape mud from the veranda steps and flinched like a horse who feels a fly on his flank and cannot get at it. She held the third pin and did not set it yet. She waited for the house to tilt. She waited for the cat to nose the jar. She waited for the boy to purse his lips just enough to blow at the candle and set it guttering so Pike would turn his head. She waited for the buyer to step toward the privy with his receipt book tucked under his arm like a baby. She waited for the Reverend to clear his throat in a way that said, "Look at me, not your fear." Then she placed the third pin gently, and a hush walked the length of her body as if something large had passed near and chosen, for the moment, not to touch her. In the wake of that hush the kitchen door, wedged by the barrel she had set, swung a little. Night air breathed against her knuckles. The fog had arrived. It entered the room like a well-behaved guest and set its hand on her shoulder. Ansa lifted the lard tin and the doll together and slid them inside the flour bin where flour dust made everything look like bone. It was time to gather the ones who would go and the ones who would make going possible. Alma waited with teeth set so hard her jaw made a pulse in her cheek. Vera had wrapped her baby tight against her chest with a strip of old sheet that Ansa had dyed with onion skins so it looked like a shadow. Ephraim, who had driven flatboats before the judge prisoned him on land to widen the cotton rows, stood outside the kitchen door with a knife where his belt used to be and a heart he could not quiet. Josh came from the smokehouse with the oar and a coil of twine that looked like a piece of night he had taught to obey. "Listen," Ansa whispered, and the word made a space where orders could live. "We move like a rumor nobody can prove. We touch only what is ours to touch. If a door closes, we unlatch the next window. If water speaks, we answer soft. Do not run until I say run. Do not stop until I say water." Alma nodded once, a bow that consecrated fear. Vera kissed her child's forehead and it made a sound like a moth trapped in a jar. Ephraim's fingers flexed. Josh looked at the sky where fog condensed into beads on his lashes. They moved. The first step was a small one, the sort a person makes when avoiding a sleeping cat. The second step was the size of a heartbeat. The third step required a choice. At the corner of the house Pike's shadow thinned and widened as he turned. Ansa had timed the jar and the candle, but men give surprises. He walked toward them, whip coiled loose in his hand. He did not see them yet. He saw the gap in the kitchen door and felt the night come through it like a thief, and that was enough to draw him. Ansa lifted her palm to make her people stop without stopping. She reached into the flour bin and placed her fingers on the doll's chest where the silver hair lay hidden. She did not have a pin in her hand, she had patience. She pressed with the pad of her thumb and Pike's breath hitched like a dog's when it smells a copperhead under the board. He stopped in the doorway, nostrils wide, convinced that this was the moment the thing hunting him chose to breathe his air. Josh slipped behind him as light as a shadow that has learned to walk on its edges. He did not hit him. He placed 2 fingers at the bottom of the man's skull where the pins had taught the judge to ache and touched. Pike swayed. If a body wants to drop and another hand gives it permission, it will do so gladly. Pike sank to one knee, whip sliding from his hand like a snake deciding winter had come. He did not faint. He did not cry out. He put a hand on the floor and panted like a man who had run through a field of bees and reached a fence at last. "God don't like weeping men," he muttered to himself, as if someone had told him that once and it had become a prayer. He stayed kneeling. He stayed distracted. That was all Ansa required. They moved around him, a tide parting around a rock, letting the water speak for their feet. Alma paused one heartbeat too long when Pike's shoulder brushed her skirt. Ansa caught her sleeve and pulled with the weight of a mother. They reached the corner. They reached the cane. The cane admitted them with a hiss like secrecy. By the cane break, beneath the window where Mrs. Barrow's porcelain girls slept in their trunk, Josh had already propped the oar and the length of twine. The skiff would not slide to the river until the last half of the plan sang. For now, they needed only to be between house and water with choices intact. Fog pressed close to them until each face wore the same pale. Ansa sent Ephraim ahead to the little dock to listen for the river's mouth as if it were a friend telling a joke that must be timed just so. She pressed her hand to Vera's back and felt milk seep under the bandage cloth where the baby had anchored happiness without permission. Alma's fingers were cold. Ansa lifted them to her mouth and breathed upon them the way Mother Ludi did for the little ones when fevers made them clench. Faint in the yard, the buyer's voice rose, offended on behalf of men who think purchases should not come with weather. "This mist offends my accounts," he said. The judge's reply floated after, "It will pass." "Pike." Pike did not answer. The judge's voice sharpened. "Pike." From the darkness near the nursery another sound answered. It was not Pike. It was the scrape of something inside the porcelain girl's trunk, the sound of wood on wood where no wood should move. Ansa knew that sound too. It meant someone had hidden what should not be hidden there. It meant a hinge had decided to confess. She had hidden the oar there earlier, now it was gone, and someone else was moving the trunk. Her plan had rooms, Ludi had said, and sometimes a chair rocks by itself. The chair rocked. Ansa exhaled, then signaled. Ephraim's silhouette returned from the dock, closer now, whispering, "Water's ready," singing low. Josh lifted the twine. Alma shifted her weight like a doe deciding which way the wind blew. Vera eased her baby's head a little lower. Then a lantern swung out from the veranda and cut the fog into slices. Not the judge's lantern. Smaller, meaner light. It swung with a child's uneven confidence. The judge's daughter toddled into the doorframe holding it by the handle, grinning at her own daring. Behind her walked Mrs. Barrow, hands outstretched, more afraid of fire on wood than of people in fog. Behind them, the Reverend's wife hissed, "Pull her back," and Reverend Greaves croaked a prayer that came out shaped like a warning to no one in particular. The lantern's light caught a glint of metal near the nursery window. The oar lay propped there no longer. In its place was a small iron thing that did not belong to Ansa's plan at all, a trap, jaws open, slicked with bare fat so it gleamed like a smile. Pike had set it in some new paranoia of his, or the judge had, or the buyer, someone had placed a different sentence in Ansa's story without asking. Ansa's heart beat once so hard it made a noise in her ear. She could call to the child and make her drop the lantern, she could run and snatch it, she could wait and pray the child turned. She pressed her thumb against the doll inside the flower again, as if it were a bell to ring across the house. A new sound answered instead, the clatter of hooves beyond the fence, hurried and many. Not the buyer's team. Not the judge's bay. Hooves that belonged to men who hadn't been invited, mistakes from someone else's math. In the fog their shapes were only blotched movement, but their noise was certain as law. Ansa turned her face toward the river, toward Josh, toward the dock, toward the plan that had so many rooms and so many chairs and so many windows that could slam if one child's lantern swung wrong. She opened her mouth to say the word she had promised would be the word that meant everything. And from the porch, a voice she had not planned for said her name. Ansa. She had never heard the judge say her name like that, as if it were a coin he was testing with his teeth, as if it could be counterfeit. She felt the weight of the key against her ribs like a brand heating. Her mouth opened to say water. The lantern tilted. The trap glinted. The hoofbeats grew near enough to announce riders who would upset prices and prayers alike. Her plan reached for the next room and found the door was not where she had left it. Wah! This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Wah! The word left Ansa's mouth like a stone pushed from an overfull hand, small and heavy enough to begin a slide. Fog received it. Ephraim answered with a hiss that was almost a prayer, and Josh moved first, not running, not yet, but in that irreversible lean a body makes when it has chosen a direction. Alma clutched Ansa's sleeve, Vera tucked her baby's head deeper into the band of cloth, and they slipped into the cane as the child's lantern wobbled toward the iron jaws. Set it down, bird, Mrs. Barrow murmured to her daughter, fear softening her voice into something that in another life might have been tenderness. Set it. The lantern kissed the trap, and the trap snapped on light. A bright spit flared and died, leaving only the wheeze of oil. The child squealed, delighted by the noise, and the adults exhaled in a single ragged breath that Fogg drank like a secret. "Ansa." The judge's voice flattened itself against the porch rail, coming from a mouth working around pain he couldn't name. He could not see her, only the idea of her, and it was enough to rattle the pins without her touching the doll at all. "Water," Ansa said again, lower, to bind her people to the river rather than the voice that reached for them. She led with her shoulder, parting Kane with as little protest as possible, letting Fogg and the river's damp brush their skin until even her own hand before her face looked like a thought, not a hand. Behind them, hoofbeats thudded to the fence and stopped with a metal cake-lang. The riders hadn't come for kindness. The fog made their curses sound like prayers from men who didn't know how to mean them. Pike, still on one knee, stood with the clumsy dignity of a man who has remembered his job only after dropping it. "Judge," he barked to prove his usefulness. "I got it. I'll find M. Like rats, sir." "Like?" He took one step and found the cane. Fogg took his confidence into its pocket and left him a smaller version of himself. In the obscurity, he swung his whip once into air just to feel something obey him. The crack stitched itself to the mist and disappeared. "Move," Ansa whispered, and their feet learned a rhythm, 2 careful steps, pause, 2 careful steps, pause. The pauses weren't for listening, though she listened, they were to keep their bodies from outrunning their breath. She had learned, sewing, that haste leaves a thread snarled and a seam weak. Escape is a seam too. At the dock, the river finally showed itself as more than voice, a brown sheet shaped by a dark soul, the current grinning crooked at the edges where it loved the bank too much. Ephraim crouched, fingers spread, feeling the slap of water on wood. "She's lifting," he whispered. "Hungry to be gone." Josh dragged the skiff by its nose from the cane with a care that made Ansa love him for the 1000th time, for the way he cared for Wood like a friend and not a tool. They eased it into the slot by the crooked post and Fogg immediately smoothed its outlines into a ghost that happened to float. Alma climbed in first, then Vera with the baby, then Ephraim and Josh. Ansa hesitated, turned her head back toward the house where the judge's name had been spoken like an accusation that finally found a mouth. She felt for the weight under her bodice, the cupboard key, warm against her skin, and for the lard tin buried in flour, for the doll that had been her scalpel and mirror both. "Ansa," Alma breathed, tugging her back to the present. "Please." She stepped into the skiff. It took her weight with a gracious slide that made her think of a promise kept. "Push," she said, and the men's shoulders worked like low bells. The skiff slid free, nose to current, the oar testing softness along the bank. Fogg laid a cool hand on their scalps. Behind them the house became a dim palace drawn by a child, all right angles and wrong windows. A cry rose from the yard, female, sharp enough to crack sugar, which is to say brittle. Mrs. Barrow had realized her child stood farther from her than she had believed. In that slice of sound Ansa heard not only possession but fear, and the two were not easy to tell apart. She turned her head enough to mark the lantern's dull afterglow, the trap's gaping grin, the silhouettes of men on horses who didn't trust their horses in fog. Josh's oar made a soft clock of the river, dip, pull, lift, dip, pull, lift. Ephraim shipped a second oar in careful strokes, steering for a seam in the mist that Ansa would not have recognized if she hadn't taught herself to look for seams all her life. All around, the low wet smells of willow and old rope and fish slithered up and over the skiff's sides. The baby made a complaint like a creak and Vera hushed him with milk and the promise of movement. "Down," Ansa murmured when the river moaned under the point of a stump. They ducked as if the fog itself were a roof beam waiting to bark their heads, and the skiff slid under the leaning arm of a dead cypress that came out of nowhere like a story you'd meant to tell and forgot until it sprang back into you whole. "Behind us," Ephraim said without looking. "Hear that?" Hoofbeats had found rhythm again on firmer ground. Men on horses had dismounted and were cussing in voices clipped by the habit of command. Oars creaked, not theirs. Another boat. The buyer's men had sense enough to try the river too. Ansa pictured the buyer's receipt book hugged to somebody's ribs inside a coat, stupid as a sleeping child in a war. Left seam, Josh breathed. Ephraim saw it too, the faintest thinning in the fog where current made a road. They angled toward it. Ansa pulled the lard tin into her lap and opened it with her thumb, careful to keep the doll wrapped. Her body remembered what pain the pins could order. She didn't want pain, not yet. She wanted confusion. For confusion, there was a practice Ludi had taught her: breathe a wish into dust and let the dust decide where to lay. Ansa had taken a pinch of ash from the hearth for this river, mixed with flour and ground willow bark. She breathed into the powder, one breath for sight, one for sound, one for belief, and then she opened her fist at the water. The dust fell without falling, melted into fog like a thought finishing itself. Behind, a man cursed with the sudden certainty that he had forgotten his own name. Another muttered, "Where's the post?" as if the river owed him a peg to tie the world to. Oars slapped wrong. A boat pivoted like a stubborn cow. Their sound moved crosswise, away. "You did that?" Alma whispered too loud. "I nudged the mirror," Ansa said, and it surprised her how tired her whisper sounded in her own ears. She let the doll rest against her ribs and steadied her breath the way she did when a scene ran long and her hands ached but she hadn't any business stopping. They made the first bend. The plantation slid away as if it had always been a story drawn on wet paper. "Where?" Ephraim asked, meaning not the immediate where of the bend and the snag but the other where, the one beyond the bend and the bend after. "Willow Tongue," Ansa said. "Ludi's place by the cut." She said to aim for the cypress that looks like a man bowing. "From there, the back channel will take us to the old ferry stump. After that, we walk mud for a quarter mile with our feet pretending they're quieter than they are. Then the trace." "The trace," Josh repeated, both as hope and as caution. The trace could be freedom or a trap. Today it would be a thread drawn through a stubborn cloth. Fog thickened, then thinned, then settled again like a blanket trying to get comfortable. Twice they fended off a log, and once a sliding root felt along the skiff's belly like a hand, testing for softness. Vera made a little song without words. The baby slept, drinking in his sleep as if he believed milk came from dreams. The second bend carried them to the bowing cypress. It did look like a man, Ansa thought, the way an old man at a church door leans to hear a child's secret. She lifted her hand to him because it seemed polite. Josh laid the blade of his oar along the boat and let the current pinch them into the back channel like a seamstress snicking a fabric strip into bias. At Willow Tongue, Mother Ludi stepped from the fog as if she were the fog's own daughter. "You heard the hymn," she said, voice bright with relief she hid beneath manner. "I half believed the river would keep you for itself just to be greedy." Ansa almost let herself fold into Ludi's arms, but there were too many arms. She put her hand instead on the older woman's shoulder, fingers saying what her mouth couldn't afford: "We made it so far, say the next thing fast." Ludi did, because she was a woman who knew order in a rush. Two men came up the old trace this hour back, hungry like folks who lost money. I fed them a lie, told them the buyer's man went on to the ferry, angry as a hornet. They went that way. They'll drink their anger down in 50 steps when the mud laughs at their boots. You go the left way. The left way is longer, Ephraim said. The left way is quieter, Ludi said, and gives you the ridge where the fox holes. If somebody follows, they'll choose the road. You choose the animal's road. Josh hefted the oar. Boat? Hide her in the cattails, Ludi said. All boats are cousins, they tell on you if their noses show. Lay her flat, say a word, leave her like a sleeping dog. Tomorrow I'll wake her and point her elsewhere with a push. They did as told, Ansa's fingers lingering on the skiff's gunwale in a goodbye that felt like leaving a room you'd put your best work into. Then they stepped onto the spongy patch between water and trace, reed hummocks giving under their feet like people surrendering chairs without meaning to stand up yet. Mud tried to climb their ankles. Fog curled like breath around their calves. Ansa moved in front with Ludi, Alma behind her, Vera and Josh following as if they'd always been arranged like this by a wise hand. They reached the ridge with the fox's holes, little scoops in the earth that looked like the mouths of sleeping things. Ludi lifted her skirt enough to avoid a root and spoke in a tone she used to nurse fevers. When fear is a bowl, you put water in it and call it useful. Ansa nodded like a student. They walked. The fog lifted in shreds. As it did, morning came on enough to pull more sound out of birds, and a lazy sun stepped into its job with the look of a boy who has been promised biscuits if he behaves. The trace unrolled, 2 ruts and a spine, old as bad decisions. Far left, the ferry road muttered with distant anger. A shout rose once, shaped like Ansa's name again, not from the house, from somewhere nearer. She didn't look back. A look can be a hook. At a bend where a pine had split in long ago lightning, they stopped because stopping and listening is a kind of movement too. Ludi touched Ansa's elbow, and the touch meant turn your ear down like a cup. From the riverside, oars, more than one set, not in drill but in quarrel. From the road, a horse coughing and a man saying, softer than he meant to, not this way. Left, Ansa whispered. We stay the animals' road. They cut into scrub, following deer sign, grass parted the width of a hunger. Twice Vera stumbled and made no complaint. Twice Alma's hand found Ansa's sleeve. Once, Josh's shoulder knocked a sapling and the sapling said his name and then apologized to the wind for gossiping. By noon, the fog had become only a memory the sunlight couldn't quite erase. They made a dry place under a live oak whose roots gripped earth like a mother tired of lending her children to bad uncles. Ludi passed a strip of dried meat around, and for the first time since night, Vera took in something that wasn't milk. The baby snored in little puffs, proof that some parts of the world will sleep even when the world is a drum. Tell me the rest, Ludi said to Ansa quietly while the others chewed. What you plan after the trace? I want to hold it in my mouth a while so it can learn my teeth. Ansa swallowed. The dried meat was sawdust in judgment and it felt good to move it past a throat that had been mostly whisper. We make meridian, she said. There's a colored carpenter named Tyvel who owes Josh an old debt and a new kindness. He has boards laid aside for folks who need a floor that isn't a jail. After that, we hedge our bets, some will go east with the railroad mud, some will follow the river where it's thin, and some will stay long enough to grow a green thing without writing its name down. And you? Ludi asked. Ansa looked at the live oak's leaves, the way light lodged in them like coins. I thought I'd go with the river until it gives me a place that asks less than my whole name. Then she shook her head, a small motion that loosened hair at her temple. Or I thought that until the judge spoke my name and made it sound like a dropped nail. Now I feel like I don't want to go until I've taken the sound of my name away from his mouth. Ludi's long tooth showed when she smiled. Revenge that doesn't eat the person who carries it is a delicate stew. Keep tasting it. Ansa touched the lard tin. I won't burn the house, she said, and heard how harsh she sounded. But I will unhouse him. How? Alma asked, surprised by her own hunger to hear it. Ansa drew with a finger in the dust between roots, a rectangle for the judge's ledger, a line for the road, a curve for the river, a dot for the sheriff who liked money better than men, a star for a church that had once let a woman hide in its bell mouth for a whole day, ringing the hour of her own rescue. By making his numbers fight him, she said. By making the man who loves paper sign a paper that undoes him. Letters have been a whip. We can teach them to be a key. Josh leaned in. You mean the bond, he said, tasting the word like iron. The one he posted to get a new line of credit for more land. The one he bragged about to the lawyer. The one with the clause about bodies counted and shipments made. Ansa nodded. He boasted while he waited for pie. I listened and then I went and looked at the bond when I dusted the study. I learned that if shipments don't make, the man who underwrites pulls his hand back so fast he'll skin a knuckle. And if the judge can't show bodies as bonds, his friends will suddenly remember they meant to love somebody else. You mean to take his bond, Josh said, half incredulous, half worshipping the audacity of the idea. Not take, Ansa said. Confuse. Then bring the paper to the one thing he fears more than the night, a white hand above his own that says no without raising a whip. There's a judge above a judge, and his God is arithmetic, not prayer. Ludi chuckled low. Girl, you make a doll of paper too. I make a mirror of it, Ansa said softly. I'm tired of his face being the only one we see in the glass. They ate, drank what little water they had, and began again. The trace wound them into afternoon, then spleened off into two ruts that led toward a stand of pines. At the split, a small wagon creaked out, drawn by a mule with a white eye. On its seat sat a woman about Mrs. Barrow's age but not her kind of woman. This one wore a hat that looked like it had fought rain and won, and her hands were roped with veins like roots. Her skin was the color of pecan shells. She slowed when she saw them, taking in the shapes of runaways and the baby in Ludi's cool gaze with the speed of someone who'd had cause to look before. You got the smell of a fresh story on you, she said. I'm Mava Greer. I sell soap and thread and sometimes a lie. Any of those you needing? Lie first, Ludi said, without shame. Price fair. Mava studied Ansa like a butcher studies a joint, measuring where bone meets meat. Who you running from? A ledger with a man attached, Ansa said. Mava's white-eyed mule flicked one ear. I might have seen a man talking to his ledger like it was his girl, back 3 miles. I told him the ferry was closed till the fog took up its mind. He didn't like that the river makes up its own mind, but he liked me saying it like a law. He went toward Sheriff Carlson instead, if that's the man you met with the dot in the dirt. If you're going the ridge, you want to cut left and take the fire break. Men on horses don't think to look where men with brooms cut trees polite. What do we owe? Ansa asked. Mava reached into the wagon bed and held up a spool of thread with the exact shade of dawn in it. You give me news next time I see you, that you made it or that you didn't and need burying. Either way, I'll have a use for the story. Deal, Ludi said before Ansa could decide if she liked the terms. It felt right anyway. They turned left at the fire break and let the way trees stepped back make a road for them. Evening considered arranging itself again. The fog had long since sobered into clear air. Birds gave the day's last opinions. The trace flattened into a place where, if a person had not been hunted all day, they might have paused to admire how the sky learned pink without anyone teaching it. They didn't pause. They reached the edge of meridian by the blue time, the hour when shadows grow brave enough to touch the fronts of houses. Tyvel, the carpenter, lived behind a church that had been painted white so often it wore the color like a lie, soft and pretty until your hand touched and found grit. He opened his door with a nail behind his ear and a memory in his eyes of the day the judge had bragged. Josh, he said, and the way he said the blacksmith's name made it clear the debt wasn't a number but a saved boy, a mended axle, a laugh on a cousin's bad day, some old goodness still warm. Bring them in. Inside, the house smelled like pine curls and stew. A thin woman with a face shaped by hunger and humor both put bowls on a table. 2 children stared at Alma as if bravery were a coat you could try on. An old dog lifted an eyebrow and put it down again. Ansa resisted the urge to turn and bolt. It was too much to see a room that would hold them. Vera sat and fed the baby, hands so stiff with easing that Ansa wanted to pry them and kiss their palms. Alma sank to a stool like a witness finally allowed to sit. Josh leaned his back to a wall as if it might move if not supervised. Ephraim looked for a door's second exit because men who know rivers also learn houses. Tyvel closed the shutters and lit a lamp. It made a circle of yellow that turned faces into stories. You got a day and a night, he said. Then the trace won't be your friend anymore. He turned to Ansa. Josh says you want a paper. A bond, Ansa said. I want to make it argue with itself, and I want help giving it to the man who enjoys that kind of argument. Tyvel's mouth curled. I can get you near the man. He takes supper with a banker on Wednesdays who plays cards after prayer meeting and cheats at both. Banker owes me a stare that didn't squeak for a year like I promised. It squeaked in 6 months because his house can't help telling on him. He might pay that debt by looking away while a paper moves from one pocket to another. Wednesday, Ludi said, counting days with her knuckles. That's tomorrow. You go fast. Ansa's heart made a fist, then opened it. I go, she said. But before that, I have one thing to return. She took the lard tin out, and from it the doll, linen and calico, ribbon vein, silver hair nested where a heart would be. She laid it on Tyval's table, and for the first time since stitching it, she allowed herself to see it as it truly was, not just a mirror for a man but a weight she had carried that had weighed her too. Ludi rested a fingertip on the doll's foot. It got you this far. It did, Ansa said. I don't want to become it. She took out the pins. Each one had learned the judge's language. Each came out with the small sigh a thread makes when freed. She put them back in the tin and shut it so it made a dull little applause. Tomorrow, she said. We do the clever part. Tonight, we teach our bodies not to jump when a floor creaks. They slept in shifts, Ansa not so much sleeping as teaching her muscles the shape of rest while her mind rehearsed a staircase, a room, a man's coat, the weight of paper. In the darkest hour, the baby woke and laughed for no reason people could hear. In the lightest hour, a rooster with more opinion than talent tried to sing and failed on his second note. Morning lay down like a clean sheet. Wednesday came with its own choreography. The church bells counted the banker's piety. Women in aprons escorted single-file casseroles as if to war. Men shook hands and looked at each other's shoes. After prayers, chairs scraped as if righteousness required rearranging furniture. Tyval passed a word to a deacon who passed it to a cousin who cashed it with a nod at the banker's boy who owed Tyval a stare. The boy scratched his ear and looked annoyed at having to pay non-money. He led Ansa to a pantry where jars of peaches watched from their glass prisons. In there, he said, tipping his head at a little back office. He takes coffee after him singing with the judge. He did not ask which judge. Men in Meridian knew which judge. Ansa wore a dress borrowed from Tyval's wife that made her look like a different answer to the same question. She carried the lard tin wrapped in a shawl as if it were a covered loaf. Inside the lard tin, not the doll that she'd left under Ludi's guard, but paper cut to the size of a bond and ink the color of someone else's authority, and, between those, the judge's linen strip that would tell the bond where to go. She stepped into the back office as if she had been called. The banker sat with his coffee, and with him, Judge Whitford Barrow, whose face on this day was a study in how a man carries private pain and public pride. His eyes were pebble-hard, ringed in little shadows, the look of a person who had slept wearing his own fear as a shirt and found it chafed. There you are, the banker said to Ansa automatically, because men fed by women grow used to saying such things even to strangers when a tray moves. He didn't look up when he said it. That was a talent Ansa had counted on, to be seen only as motion, not person. She placed the tin on the sideboard and took the cups to the samovar, giving herself the angle she needed and the seconds to catch breath. She smelled sugar and arrogance. She heard the rustle of a paper under the judge's hand and felt in her bones how much he worshipped the sound. Your bond, the banker said, patting the judge's arm. We'll square the ledger after supper. No need to fret. His voice had the soothing oil of a man who mentioned mercy at the exact moment he measured profit. Ansa turned and brought the cups. As she set them down, she let her shawl slip and fumbled with the tin lid in the way of a tired woman who had carried too many trays. The lid clinked. The judge's attention twitched. He looked, not at her face, but at the shawl's edge and the glint he fancied he saw. His hand left his paper to steady the lid as if noise were a spill. Sorry, Ansa whispered, and every time she had pretended apology in a house that wasn't hers gathered in that single sound and made it perfect. The banker clicked his tongue. They never mind a lid, he said, like a man trying to be funny with his money. Ansa's right hand lifted the coffee pot. Her left hand, knuckle shadowed by the shawl, slid the judge's folded bond sideways and in the space of that slide let the linen strip kiss it, just a brush, so small it could have been static. Then she set the coffee down and retrieved from the shawl a folded paper of the same heft. She laid it where the bond had been. The judge, distracted by the pain that Ansa had taught him to expect in the banker's talk, touched the top paper without reading it. He nodded at numbers as if they could see him and approve. He signed the top with a flourish that Ansa had practiced alone at night with her own name in water on the table. Excellent, the banker said. The judge said through his teeth, pressing his side with a righteous murmur. He pushed back from the table. "Let's put this back with the other proofs," he said, and shoved the paper toward Ansa without seeing her, expecting hands to obey. She obeyed. She took the paper to the filing drawer behind the desk, opened it, and slid the top paper into the bottom slot. In the top slot, she placed the bond, his bond, between a church ledger and a sheaf of promissory notes the banker had no business keeping in the same drawer. Linen tells linen where to lay down. Cloth remembers cloth. When the banker returned later to tally hems and debts, his hand would go to the top slot out of habit and pull the bond up when he wanted the church ledger, and his eyebrows would argue with his mouth, and habit would finish the crime. "Thank you," the banker said without seeing her. He took the cups. The judge stood. Ansa lifted the lard tin and shawl and melted backward, through the pantry, out into the corridor where jars of peaches witnessed another small revolution of their own. Her hands shook only once she reached the churchyard's far hedge. Ludi waited, pretending to examine a bulletin that promised redemption for a nickel. "Did it lay where you aimed?" she asked. "Yes," Ansa said. "Now we wait for arithmetic to do what men won't." They didn't wait long. By evening word moved out with the banker's boys the way Stink moves without needing company. The underwriter and Jackson had been wired with figures that did not figure. A bond had been signed whose terms had not been met even as they were being written. The banker's hand had pulled the wrong proof, and in the confusion he'd sent not only the wrong paper but a more insulting letter than he meant. By morning, the man above the man had said the small word Ansa had wanted, no. The no did not free everybody. It did something more surgical. It unpinned the judge from his friends. Men who had laughed at his jokes yesterday found their mouths tired today. A merchant who had extended him good cloth for bad assurances suddenly recalled a brother-in-law in need and withdrew his barrel of favors. Sheriff Carlson, who liked to ride past the judge's place with a bow, rode by at noon without looking, as if the road bent elsewhere. Even Pike walked smaller, because a master who bleeds money bleeds power, and men like Pike drink either as it runs. Ansa watched from Tyval's shutter as news unseated arrogance across 3 streets. When she turned from the slat, Josh was watching her the way a man watches a forge fire settle after an honest day. "You going back?" he asked, not to scold but because the question belonged to the air now. "To finish what the pin started." Ansa felt inside for the answer and found it there like a seed that had waited rain. "Not to finish. To return what isn't mine and claim what is." That night, with Ludi, Josh, and Alma, she walked the animals' road backward. Vera stayed with Tyval, safer now under the no than under the river's kiss. Ephraim took a different path to find a cousin with a wagon that knew how to hide its own tracks. The moon wore a gauze the fog had left behind just to remember them by. They reached Barrow's place at the hour when even wickedness yawns. The house had quieted into the nervous still of a body listening to its own bad heart. From the river, fog rose again, not as thick as before, but enough to smudge edges. A lone lantern burned on the veranda, not swinging now but steady, like a watcher who had given up pretending and just watched. The judge sat beside it. His hand raked absently at his side as if to remind Payne that he had not forgotten it. Ansa stepped out from the cane. She did not crouch or skulk. She walked the yard like a woman who has asked the river permission and received it. The judge didn't start. He had been expecting ghosts. A real woman surprised him more than a phantom would have. "You," he said, and in a single syllable tried to fit all his injuries, physical and arithmetic. "You." Ansa stopped 3 boards' width from the foot of the steps. "My name," she said, and it almost hurt her to give it, "is Ansa Lark. You will not say it again unless you are blessing someone else with it." He laughed with no pleasure in it. "You threaten me now that your fog has made me a fool?" "You made yourself a fool," she said. I held up a mirror. She set the lard tin on the bottom step and pushed it with her toe until it rested within his reach. "I brought you what you're owed." He squinted. "Lard?" "A doll," she said. "A linen shape that learned your weight. It taught you to look inward while other things happened. I am done with it." He did not reach for the tin. His pride wouldn't let him touch anything from her hand. "You came to confess?" he asked, trying to make court in his yard. "I came to claim." She kept her voice low. "Vera's baby, his name will not be in your ledger anymore. Alma's blood is hers. Joshua's hands won't build you nothing that lasts. Ephraim will not teach you the river like a tame dog. Their names are not your arithmetic. I came to say it where the house could hear." He leaned back as if the chair had become a snake and he couldn't decide whether to ride it or throw it. "You think letters can unmake what letters made?" "Yes," Ansa said simply. "I learned them. I wrote them. I'll keep writing until they hold us instead of bind us." From the side of the house, Pike stepped into the lantern light with his face chiseled by a hard day. He looked smaller than he had on all the days when the whip made him taller. "We can end it now, sir," he said to the judge, but his eyes flicked to Ansa as if asking her for permission to keep being the man his job had asked him to be. "No," the judge said, surprising them both. "We end it when I say it ends. It ends when law says it ends." He stood, all dignity and ache. He nudged the lard tin with his boot as if to free a snake he could then kill with story. The lid popped and slid. He looked in. The doll watched him without eyes. He stared back and saw himself, linen, pins, ribbon vein, and in a wash that moved up through his gut and sat in his throat like river mud. He realized what his nights had been, not devils, not God, not women's whispers, himself, reflected back by clever hands. The discovery did not make him kind. It made him furious the way men get when a woman's intelligence reveals how small their own power looks in a mirror. "I should burn this," he said, and his voice shook. "Then burn it," Ansa said, "and see if fire takes your fear with it." He couldn't. His hands had not been taught to lift flames without servants. He stood there, as ignorant with matches as he was with mercy. Ansa stepped back. "Keep it," she said. "When you feel your side ache, press it there and ask what it's telling you. It will answer if you're brave, which you're not." She turned. "Come," she said to the dark where Ludi and Alma and Josh waited. "We're done here." "Stop," the judge said, finally remembering the old tools of manhood. "Sheriff Carlson." "Won't be coming," Ludi answered for Ansa, stepping into the light like a story that had finally gotten tired of being a rumor. He had to go count the banker's sorrow first. Arithmetic is the only badge he polishes careful. Pike looked between them and the judge and his whip, suddenly the smallest part of his hand. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, not sure who deserved the question. "Learn a trade," Josh told him, and for a moment the blacksmith's voice forgave a man who had not asked forgiveness. "You can make shoes for people to walk away with." They left. No one ran. The house behind them creaked once and then settled as if relieved to be told a secret out loud. Fog accompanied them to the cane and kissed them goodbye at the riverbank. In the weeks that followed, the world did not change in the way a story sometimes pretends it can. It changed how maps really change, slow, then all at once on one corner, then slow again. A deputy who had laughed in the face of a woman at market found himself puzzled by the fact that the woman did not flinch. A merchant who had sized Alma like cloth dropped his tape when his wife looked at him as if he had miscounted their own daughter. The banker, red with an anger he didn't know how to baptize, learned the humility of writing his own no to a bigger man's no and called it weather. Sheriff Carlson bought a better pen. The judge kept the doll. He kept it hidden, first in his desk, then in his bedroom chest, then under the cushion of his church pew as if God would sit on it for him and absorb its sting. None of the places worked. Pain in his side returned whenever he tried to sign a paper that turned a person into number. He went out on the veranda at night and pressed the linen to his ribs until sometimes the hurt quieted in a way that sounded to Ansa, in her memory, like a truth speaking. As for Ansa, she returned to Meridian, not to hide but to tend what they had planted. She took a room near Tyval's shop and stitched for women who paid her in coin and gossip. She taught letters in the church's back room where jars of peaches kept watching, and she taught the letters to kind children who held them like birds, and to hard men who learned to wrap their mouths around shapes that none of their masters had wanted them to form. "This is your name," she would say, guiding a finger. "It isn't a debt. It isn't a price. It is a sound that belongs to you. Alma took work at the boarding house, holding plates like commandments and refusing any man's hand that thought biscuits came with a body. Vera nursed not only her baby but 2 others whose mothers had to work the railroad ditch. Milk can be a politics as well as mercy. Ephraim ran packages for men who smiled too wide and used doctrine like a trap. He read every paper he carried now because Ansa had taught him you must teach a letter to be a key or it will volunteer to be a lock. Josh built skiffs and the occasional coffin, because this was still Mississippi and fog does not hide everything you ought not to see. He kept a hammer for nails and a second hammer for arguments. He came to Ansa's window some nights and touched the sill with 2 fingers, and the quiet that passed between them was not absence but a decision not to put names to all the ways 2 people can bear the same load. Mother Ludi kept treating fevers and coaxing babies into their breath and laying old women down with hymns that never learned English. When she walked by the river, it curled a little toward her as if to tell her gossip. She pretended not to hear. She had already learned too much. Summer rose and stacked itself, and with it stories. People began to say in whispers that a judge had been pinned by a doll and learned a limit to his appetite. People began to say in pews that a girl had used paper to fight paper and not been poisoned for her audacity. People began to say at markets that mothers could speak their children's names without watching for a ledger. The stories weren't all true. They were true enough to make room. One afternoon, some months hence, a carriage stood outside Tyville's shop with its curtains humble for once and its driver sober. Judge Whitford Barrow stepped down awkwardly and held his hat like a confession. He asked the boy on the stoop where the seamstress lived. The boy pointed. The judge knocked. Ansa opened the door because in this life, courage is not always a dramatic thing. Sometimes it is opening a door and letting a man stand on a threshold long enough to find the size of himself. He didn't meet her eyes. He held the lard tin. It was cleaner now, foolishly shined. "This is yours," he said. "It never was," Ansa answered, and the softness in her voice surprised them both. "It was our weather. You can keep it." He shifted. "I came for a letter," he said at last. "A name. To write it right." He swallowed. "A child." Ansa stood aside. The judge stepped into the little room where letters lived on cheap paper and a better hope. He took the pencil like a man takes a needle, unsure where to place the point. Ansa guided his hand, hers hovering, not touching, until he got the first sound down. He wrote the child's name. It was a plain name, and it cut him to write it. He did it again. He left the page and the nose ink on it like something risky and worthwhile. When he turned to go, he glanced at the doll on her shelf. She had taken it back. She hadn't told herself why. Maybe a person keeps the tools that carved her even when she no longer needs them, like a midwife keeping a cloth that caught a first breath. He looked at the doll and then at her and, in the smallest voice she had ever heard him use, said, "Does it hurt less if a man says sorry?" "Sometimes," Ansa said. "If he learns to be the sort of man who doesn't need to say it again tomorrow." He nodded like a student who might yet study. He left. Outside, the river barked laughter at a dog. The sky filled with a weather that hadn't been ordered. That night, in the back room, Ansa taught 3 girls their names and then, because stories are coals that long to light other stories, she told them how to fold paper around truth without letting the fire catch their fingers. She spoke not of dolls but of mirrors and fog and arithmetic that could be bent into mercy. "You don't need pins to make a man see himself," she said. "Sometimes you need a seam and a steady hand." When the girls left, Alma stopped in the doorway and looked back. "What do we call what you did?" she asked. "So we can recognize it when it comes around again wearing a different dress." Ansa thought of the doll and the letters and the river and the fog and the way a body learns its own weight when it steps into a skiff. She thought of the judge pressing Len into his ribs and not knowing whether to pray. She thought of Vera's milk and Josha's hammers and Ludi's tooth and Mava's white-eyed mule. She smiled. "We call it making a way," she said. "We call it the work." On the last day of that long summer, fog came again, not to save anyone or hide anything, just to remind the river and the town of what air can do when it changes its mind. Ansa walked to the bank and held the doll. She pressed it once to her own side where worry lived and found that the ache there was small now and honest, a bruise fading, not a wound opening. She set the doll on the root of the bowing cypress and let the fog have the ribbon vein and the silver hair. She kept the cloth, the calico and linen, because cloth, like names, can be cleaned and used again. She would stitch it into a quilt and sleep under it without fear of what dreams might order her to do. The river said amen in its low language. A heron took a slow step and pretended grace was accident. Somewhere in town, a judge practiced writing a child's name. Somewhere upriver, a banker closed a drawer with care he hadn't used before. Somewhere downriver, Sheriff Coulson counted his own days instead of other people's. Somewhere on a road none of them had walked yet, a girl learned the letter that would one day begin her running. Ansa turned back toward the lights of Meridian, toward the room where paper and thread waited, toward the next seam she would make in a world that had given her scraps and dared her to call it a blanket. She smiled into the fog that wasn't hiding anything anymore, not her, not the work, not the courage it took to keep going without pins. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.